The tension in the courtroom was almost invisible at first, like a distant thunder rumbling behind the clouds. Pam Bondi entered the room with calm precision, prepared for a case that should have been straightforward. The matter at hand involved a high-profile land fraud case, one where she suspected political strings were being pulled. But what she didn't anticipate was the presence of Judge James Boasberg, a man with a calculated stare and an unnerving calm. From the moment he began presiding, something felt off. His tone was oddly dismissive, his rulings strangely biased, as if he had already made up his mind. Pam noticed how he shut down key witnesses, overruled valid objections, and steered the trial in a direction that didn't make legal sense. At first, she thought it was ego, maybe even incompetence masked by seniority. But then she caught it. A look he gave to one of the defense attorneys. It wasn't just familiarity, it was collusion. Her instincts, honed from years in the legal battlefield, kicked in hard. She began pushing back, not just on technicalities, but on principle. Boasberg did not like it. His tone sharpened, and his rulings became even more erratic. But Pam stood firm, reading between the lines and piecing together what she hadn't yet spoken aloud. It wasn't long before the courtroom morphed into a battlefield of wills. Pam's refusal to back down clashed violently with Boasberg's ironclad control, and then, during a break, she took the opportunity to dig. Quietly, strategically. She stepped out, made a call, and activated a back channel that had served her well before. What she found left her numb. Years ago, before Boasberg ever wore the robe, he had been implicated in a criminal enterprise under a completely different name. It was buried deep under sealed juvenile records and loopholes in early judicial appointments. A fraud case, money laundering through a fake nonprofit, and even whispers of jury tampering in his early legal career. All scrubbed clean. No public trace. But the evidence still lived, in a hidden document cache few even knew existed. When court resumed, the shift in Pam's energy was unmistakable. She wasn't just defending a case anymore. She was preparing for war. Boasberg sensed it. His smirk faded, and the air turned electric. The courtroom audience, the attorneys, the clerks, everyone began to feel the pull of something monumental just beneath the surface. Pam began questioning the prosecution's motives, not to win favor, but to force Boasberg's hand. She laid traps in her questioning, built a narrative that contradicted his earlier rulings, and with every word, she tightened the noose. Boasberg grew more agitated, his rulings sloppier, as if he was trying to hide something that no longer wanted to stay hidden. Then, during a particularly tense objection that Boasberg quickly tried to dismiss, Pam paused. Her voice didn't rise, but the silence that followed made it feel like the room had dropped 10 degrees. She alluded to judicial misconduct in prior courtrooms, reminded the judge of a name he hadn't used in decades, and referenced a case, file number that hadn't been spoken in over 30 years. Gasps erupted. Boasberg's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his gavel. The name Pam had dropped. It was no mistake. She was cutting through the smoke, dragging into the light a past he thought had been buried for good. And yet, the courtroom was only at the edge of the storm. The next few minutes would either shatter his legacy or confirm hers. The sound of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a warning shot, but it was too late. The name Pam had uttered, the case number she cited, they weren't just speculative jabs. They were surgical strikes, and they hit their target. The courtroom sat frozen. No one moved, not the clerks, not the attorneys, not the defendant whose trial had now become secondary to the firestorm unfolding before them. Boasberg's demeanor shifted. The calm judicial mask he wore so well cracked just enough to reveal what was underneath. Fear. It wasn't loud or theatrical. It was quiet, controlled, and lethal. He tried to regain control of the room, tried to reassert his authority, but the sudden stutter in his voice and the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. Pam stood her ground, her eyes locked on his like a hunter cornering prey. This wasn't just about the case anymore. This was about accountability, about exposing the rot that had infected the justice system and disguised itself in robes and titles. She began walking through the details, not as allegations, but as facts. Dates, names, false identities, a trail of corruption scrubbed clean by favors and forged clearances. She spoke of a small town in Ohio, long before Boasberg had stepped into public life, where a young man had quietly disappeared from the record after being arrested for financial fraud. She mentioned a fake scholarship foundation used to launder money from desperate families. She brought up sealed juvenile files, connections to early court clerks who had conveniently retired or vanished altogether. Piece by piece, she assembled a puzzle that no one else had dared to even acknowledge. Boasberg's hands clenched the bench. His eyes darted to the bailiff, to his clerk, as if searching for someone to intervene. But no one moved. The power he had wielded for years was slipping, draining out of him with each revelation. His attempts to silence Pam fell flat. Every objection he barked was met with firm legal reasoning. She knew the rules, she knew the boundaries, and she danced right up to the edge without crossing them. It wasn't just the words that shook the room, it was the way she delivered them. Calm, precise, and undeniable. There was no grandstanding, no emotional theatrics, just the cold, hard truth, spoken by someone who had seen enough injustice to know when a courtroom had become a stage for corruption. As she continued, murmurs spread among the audience. A journalist in the back began typing furiously. A defense attorney leaned forward, jaw tight, as if realizing he'd once been ruled against by this very judge in a case that never made sense. The weight of it all began to sink in. This wasn't a theory. This was exposure. Boasberg's face turned pale. He attempted to recess the court, but Pam wasn't finished. With the court still in session, she revealed a document she had uncovered during the break. It was a scanned transcript of an early arrest, buried in a rarely accessed digital archive from a defunct municipal server. The charges had been sealed when Boasberg was still a teenager, but they were severe enough that any credible vetting process would have disqualified him from ever becoming a judge. He had changed his name. He had moved states. He had used a manipulated identity to slip through the cracks of the system he now claimed to uphold. And no one had noticed. Or worse, someone had noticed and let it slide. That document hit like a detonation. The clerk froze. The bailiff's eyes narrowed. Someone in the jury box whispered something under their breath, and others followed suit. Chaos was building at the edges of the room, not in screaming or violence, but in the slow collapse of trust. This was no longer a courtroom. It was a reckoning. Boasberg's voice cracked as he demanded silence, but no one was listening. The authority he once commanded now sounded hollow, stripped of legitimacy. And Pam, unflinching, unapologetic, Athetui stood like a storm made flesh. She turned toward the gallery not to grandstand, but to ensure the message was heard by more than just the man behind the bench. She called out the institutions that had enabled him, the silence that protected him, and the blind spots that let men like Boasberg slip into power unchecked. In those moments, it wasn't just Boasberg on trial. It was the system that had allowed this to happen, and Pam had just lit the match. The moment Pam placed the document into the record, the room shifted from disbelief to calculation. Everyone inside the courtroom began reevaluating everything they thought they knew. Staff members who had once nodded dutifully at Boasberg now avoided his gaze. Attorneys who had feared his unpredictable rulings found themselves suddenly emboldened, while even the stenographer hesitated, unsure whether to continue transcribing or brace for what came next. Judge Boasberg sat rigidly at the bench, gripping his gavel like it was the last piece of power he had left. His face, usually unreadable, was now painted with raw panic, a sickening shade of gray betraying the chaos inside. His lips moved slightly, as if trying to form a denial, but no words came. He knew better than anyone that what Pam had uncovered was real. Pam didn't need to keep speaking. The facts had already been laid bare. But she wasn't finished. She directed the court's attention to a lesser-known judicial oversight board, one that had, 5 years prior, conducted a private ethics inquiry into Boasberg following a string of controversial rulings. That inquiry had been quietly closed, the file sealed under confidentiality. But Pam, through legal channels and mounting suspicion, had obtained a redacted version of the findings, enough to show that questions had been raised about his past, and enough to prove that someone had made those questions disappear. This was no longer about a single fraudulent identity or a teenage crime swept under the rug. This was about a lifetime of deception built into the very foundations of the justice system, and now it was cracking in real time. Boasberg lashed out, not physically, but with his voice. He launched into a desperate tirade, accusing Pam of violating decorum, of pursuing a personal vendetta. His words came faster, his tone wilder, and his composure was gone. What was once the booming voice of authority now sounded like a man unraveling, in public view. He slammed his gavel and attempted to strike Pam's remarks from the record, but it was futile. She had already submitted everything. The evidence lived. The courtroom couldn't unhear it. Outside the doors, a crowd had begun to form. Reporters, court officials, and curious onlookers gathered as word spread that something unprecedented was happening inside. Phones were held up to record the proceedings, and soon live streams began pinging across social media, carrying Pam's exposé far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Inside, the two officers who had quietly entered earlier now moved forward. They didn't speak. They didn't reach for their cuffs, but they positioned themselves just steps away from Boasberg's bench. Their presence wasn't theatrical, it was surgical. Their arrival wasn't about arresting him just yet. It was about signaling that the world was now watching, and that consequences had caught up with him. Pam requested a formal suspension of proceedings, not as a courtesy, but as a legal necessity. A sitting judge under active criminal suspicion could not continue to rule. The opposing counsel didn't object. Even they recognized the gravity of what was unfolding. For the first time since the trial began, Boasberg had no allies in the room. Then something remarkable happened. One of the defense attorneys, a veteran who had long remained silent during Boasberg's more questionable rulings, stood and requested a motion to dismiss the current case on grounds of judicial corruption. He spoke with careful restraint, but his eyes flicked to Pam with quiet gratitude. She had done what no one else had dared to do: challenge the rotting core of the system. Boasberg rose to his feet. He gripped the bench with both hands, eyes glassy, chest rising and falling as if each breath was a battle. But he didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. He had been cornered by the very justice he once manipulated, and in front of the people he thought he could outwit, outlast, and overpower, he now stood defeated. Pam didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Her victory wasn't personal. It was structural. The courtroom that had so often silenced the vulnerable had for once been forced to listen, and to reckon with the truth. The judge who once ruled over lives with unchecked control was now facing the same weight of justice he had long denied others. And yet one final blow remained. One final truth that would silence even the murmurs outside the courtroom and turn this scandal into a national reckoning. For a few long seconds, the courtroom became a still frame in time. Judge Boasberg remained standing behind his bench, lips parted but frozen in silence. Pam Bondi stood with her shoulders square, eyes locked onto him like a surgeon waiting for the final incision. Around them, the walls seemed to breathe with the weight of what was coming. The officers at the back of the room stepped forward. Still they did not speak. Their footsteps were deliberate, echoing across the floor like the slow ticking of a final countdown. The entire courtroom was watching not just a judge fall, but a symbol collapse. A man who had cloaked himself in legitimacy while his foundation was nothing but fraud and dust. Then Pam revealed the last piece. It wasn't buried in legal archives or sealed under some forgotten court order. It was public, hiding in plain sight, because no one had known to look for it. Years ago, under his original name, Boasberg had quietly been investigated for witness tampering. Not as a lawyer, but as a fixer. A shadowy figure who influenced trials for a price, funneling money through shell entities, and offering legal favors in exchange for silence. A former prosecutor who'd retired in disgrace had left a digital breadcrumb trail, forgotten in an old data server from a collapsed law firm. Pam had found it. She had connected it to a broader ring that until now had been dismissed as rumor. The evidence was conclusive, time-stamped, documented, and damning. The officers moved forward without hesitation. Boasberg tried to backpedal, his hands raising slightly, not in surrender but in disbelief. He began to protest, but no one listened. The courtroom was no longer his to command. One officer reached into his coat. The other addressed him calmly with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. And then, in full view of the court, Judge James Boasberg was removed from the bench. The room didn't erupt in applause. It didn't need to. The silence spoke louder than cheers ever could. For the first time in his career, Boasberg was being held to account by the very laws he had twisted for his own gain. He was escorted through the courtroom with no special treatment, no privilege, no exit through a side door. He walked past the very people he had ruled over for years, now stripped of the robe, the title, and the illusion. Pam stood still as he passed her, her expression unreadable. She didn't gloat, didn't nod, didn't flinch. Her work was done, and she wasn't there for celebration. She had stood against something larger than a single man. She had exposed a rot that had festered beneath the surface of justice and pulled it into the light where it could no longer hide. As the doors closed behind Boasberg and the officers, murmurs resumed like a returning tide. The judge's seat sat empty, glaring and symbolic. Court officials moved uncertainly, unsure how to proceed in a courtroom where the highest authority had just been removed in disgrace. The bailiff called for an extended recess, his voice lower. Now, humbled by what he had just witnessed, Pam gathered her notes calmly. She didn't linger. She didn't pose for reporters waiting outside. She walked through the hallway with quiet resolve, passing stunned faces, some grateful, some shaken, all affected. Justice, for once, had bent in the right direction. Within hours, the footage from the courtroom was broadcast across the country. News anchors struggled to catch up. Legal analysts scrambled to explain how a man like Boasberg had escaped scrutiny for so long. The judicial system was thrust under a magnifying glass, and demands for reform swept through city halls and state capitals. Judges, prosecutors, and clerks across the country began auditing their own ranks. Internal investigations were launched overnight. What Pam had triggered was no longer just a scandal. It was a cleansing. But for Pam, none of that mattered in the moment. Her job had always been simple: protect the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried, no matter how powerful the one hiding it. She had walked into a courtroom expecting to argue a case. She walked out having dismantled a corrupt legacy, and, in doing so, she reminded a nation what accountability actually looks like.